Our next speaker is Dave Sunding. Briefly, he's going to tell us how we're going to pay for all that, or not. Dave is a professor of agricultural and resource economics at Berkeley. He's the Thomas Graff Chair of Natural Resource Economics. He's the founding director of the Berkeley Water Center, and his research concerns environmental and resource economics, regulation and technological challenges, applied economics, risk, and public finances. Prior to his position at Berkeley, Dave Sunding served as a senior economist on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. And Dave Sunding is one who I've learned so much about in terms of overcoming barriers to finance and paying for some of the thoughts and strategies that we've heard about today. So, Dave, have at it.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here with all of you, many familiar faces, some new ones. One of the things that's fun for me about working on water is that it's a classic interdisciplinary problem. The challenges that we've heard about today, they can't be solved solely by engineering. They can't be solved solely by biology or legal analysis or economics or any other individual field. It's a classic interdisciplinary problem. So what I'd like to talk about today is the economic aspects of some of the themes that David was talking about and Peter talked about previously. And part of the way I would phrase this is what are the economic pluses and minuses if you put yourself in the shoes of an urban water manager and you've got this whole potential range of water supply and conservation investments that you can be making and ultimately asking your ratepayers to pay for. What are the economic factors that would determine whether or not you would want to adopt one strategy versus another? And in doing that, I'll touch on a number of themes that have come up already. I'll probably talk about them in slightly different terms. But I do, just as a threshold comment, I want to come back to something that Peter was talking about, and I think very rightly, when he started talking about how we've reached an age of limits in the development of traditional supply projects. That's definitely true. I'll talk a bit about California. I think it's true in many other places around the world too. But in a way, one thing I want to bring out here is that the situation is even worse than that comment implies, because traditional water supply projects are performing worse and worse. And that's for a number of reasons, and they're projected to perform even worse in the future than they do at present. And that has to be factored in, again, when you put yourself in a very practical position of being an urban water manager who's trying to decide, how am I going to meet future demands for water? So that's another very important theme I'd like to talk about today. So one factor that urban water managers look at, and I think they need to look at even more than they have in the past, is this notion of reliability. And reliability means different things in different contexts, but what I mean here is the ability of a water supply source to meet a particular level of demand. So if that supply source is subject to intermittent outages, whether due to seismic events or droughts or environmental regulations, that supply source would be considered to be less than perfectly reliable. And that's certainly the case with many of our most important pieces of water infrastructure here in California. There are two major kinds of stresses that are being felt on traditional surface water supplies in the state. First is environmental regulations. And this is a combination of local regulations, but most importantly, federal regulations, especially the Endangered Species Act. This is being felt on the Colorado system, certainly in the Delta, and I'll talk about the Delta a little bit more in a second. But environmental regulations are increasingly chipping away at the performance of these traditional systems that import surface water into urban areas. And second, of course, climate change. Some effects arguably are being felt currently. Certainly the expectation is that climate change will have a deteriorating effect on reliability off into the future. So that's one source of stress. The traditional sources of supply are not performing as well as they used to. Second, and here, I think there's room for some technical debate, but focusing attention, like I'm going to do in the talk, mostly on Southern California, our work projects that there actually will be some continued demand growth. Not at anything like the rates that we experienced in the 60s and 70s when the state was growing so much. But there will be some modest increase in water demand growth out to 2050. And there are factors that work in both directions. I would argue that on balance, there's a slight positive tilt to this whole thing. On the increasing demand side of the ledger, there's projected to be more people. Southern California, Northern California, it's a popular state. And the growth is projected to occur primarily in inland areas and not in the coastal areas that are already largely built out. That has important implications for water demand in a couple of ways. First of all, inland areas are hotter. That leads to more water demand. Inland areas also have lower land prices, so people tend to have more outdoor irrigation. They have larger lot sizes, more outdoor irrigation. So the fact that growth occurs inland as opposed to in coastal areas tends to increase water demand. Income levels are also projected to increase. One absolute empirical regularity that's been established in hundreds of papers is that as income goes up, people purchase more water. So as income is projected to increase, that has an increasing effect on water demand in California. But there are factors that argue for a decrease in demand. Rates are going up. Water's a commodity just like many other things that we purchase in a marketplace. As the price of it goes up, people use less of it. So that's one factor that definitely will increase demand going forward. And there's also public policies to encourage conservation that are being adopted in California, so that'll tend to decrease demand. Taking all of this on balance, what our econometric work suggests is out to 2050, there would be something between now and then, in aggregate, like a 20% increase in water demand between 2012 and 2050. So that amounts to something much less than 0.5% per year, way below the historical rates, above where they've been the last 10 years, but way below the historical rate of demand increase. So those would be two factors that I would point at right away as being stresses on urban water systems in California. Now, this is very important. This goes to the point about environmental regulations, but also climate change. And just a little bit of teeing up, this is an exceedance curve, so it's essentially a probability distribution. And it tells you the percent of years that deliveries on the state water project system, which takes water from the Delta down to Southern California, exceed a certain level. So when the curve goes up, that means more water. But this curve also tells you how the supplies are distributed between wet and dry years. And so the red line, that's where the state water project is right now. And remember, the state water project accounts for about a quarter of all the supplies going into Southern California. So it's an extremely important supply source. What DWR is projecting is through primarily increasing environmental regulations, but also some effects of climate change. So this goes out just to 2050. If we went further beyond, it would look more dramatic. But looking just out to 2050, this is the kind of deterioration that they're expecting in their own project. And what you can see is that this amounts to roughly a 30% reduction in the mean, due again mainly to ESA regulations, but also some shift of water between wet and dry years. So not only is the mean going down, but the reliability of the water supply is going down, and that more water tends to come in wet years. Now that's got major implications for the management of these urban water utilities in Southern California that have grown up relying on the state project as a foundational system. So what are the responses? I promised David no inside baseball, but I have to say one thing that's California specific, one response to that graph is the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which I've been working on a lot over the last couple of years. The state and federal contractors that take water out of the Delta, they're contemplating spending $25 billion to prevent that curve from shifting down, right? $25 billion is not going to provide any new water. That's just about keeping things in place. Now, that's its own economic decision, whether or not that's the right way to spend money, or whether or not there are other ways that money could be spent that would be better for ratepayers ultimately. But again, just understand the magnitude of the problem. You have state and federal contractors in ag and urban areas that say they're willing to spend $25 billion just to prevent this from occurring. So, what are some responses to these stresses? First, I think there's more incentive to expand the water supply portfolio through investment in alternatives. And this is maybe another way of saying what you've been hearing about this morning from David and Peter. It's more of a economic take on it, but I think we're all sort of arriving at the same place. And these alternatives could include recycling, desalination, stormwater capture, on and on. Now, when it comes down to the nitty-gritty economic comparison of, say, a water utility manager wanting to invest more heavily in a traditional supply source or invest in an alternative supply like recycling, there are a couple of things that have to be compared. Very often it's the case that the alternative water source has a higher unit cost, and I'll go through some numbers in a minute. But the alternative water supply might also have a different reliability profile. Desalination is not really subject to fluctuations in precipitation. It's going to be there every year, and that's valuable. Recycling is also valuable for the same reasons. Anything that enhances groundwater storage is valuable for the same reason. It all improves reliability. So to do a full and accurate comparison of the costs of a traditional supply source, like taking water out of the Delta, to an investment in an alternative water supply, there has to be a comparison made that includes the value of reliability. So that's what I want to talk about here. And when you include the value of reliability, these things become much closer than they might otherwise appear. So just to give you an example, if you go back to the Orange County area that David Sedlak was talking about, I do a lot of work with the Municipal Water District of Orange County, which is affiliated with Orange County Water District, but MODOC, the Municipal Water District, they're in charge of the imported water supplies that are coming from the Delta and the Colorado into Orange County. And the cost of water on that system, just to give you some examples here, the untreated Tier 1 kind of base rate that has to be paid for that water currently is $593 an acre foot. If it's treated, it goes up to $847. And then the Tier 2 rate, which is sort of on demand, there's no long-term commitment for it, that's much more expensive. That's in the range of $743 an acre foot to right around $1,000 an acre foot. So that's what imported water costs if you're, say, Orange County Water District ultimately. But neither of these supplies is totally reliable. So we're going to get to the reliability in a second, but suppose I were Orange County or Ventura or San Diego and I wanted to look at an alternative water supply. What would that cost? Well, these numbers are much higher. And these numbers are higher than you might have seen before because people sometimes forget that past investments in water supply alternatives have been heavily subsidized through a whole variety of state programs primarily. But if you take the subsidies out and look at the actual cost, this is what emerges. And as an economist, who works in planning a lot, that's appropriate to do because there's no guarantee that these subsidy programs are going to continue into the future. And furthermore, when something's subsidized, that means somebody else has to pay for part of it. And if we're looking at welfare on a statewide point of view, you wouldn't want to include that anyway. So here, just a few examples. The groundwater replenishment system, the very one that David was talking about a minute ago, has an estimated cost of right around $1,000 an acre foot. Even though parts of that system, are not new, the costs are still around $1,000. The Inland Empire Utilities Agency project, which is in the upper part of the watershed that David referred to, their recycling project had a cost of right around $1,500 an acre foot. Central Basin, which is still in Southern California, but more on the LA side, their water reliability project had a cost of just under $1,700 an acre foot. And the Elsinore Valley project was right around $1,300. So these projects, and I should say I didn't include everything in here, the San Francisco East Side Recycling Project has a projected cost of $4,500 an acre foot. So the costs are all over the place. But if you compare to, again, put yourself in the shoes of an urban water manager in Southern California, you can buy water from a traditional source, or you could do this. This is more expensive. Just based on, a 30-second analysis, these numbers are higher. Well, what about desalination? That's even worse. Ocean desalination, let's make a distinction between ocean desalination and brackish groundwater desalination. Probably the best data point for ocean desalination is the recent project in northern San Diego County, the Carlsbad project. No one knows exactly how that's going to come out, but the projected costs are between $2,000 an acre foot and $2,300 an acre foot. Peter says it's higher. It could very well be, yeah. The brackish water desalination is cheaper for a whole number of reasons. That's more down in the range of $1,200 to $1,700. But you get the basic point. Actual costs for a particular project, they're all over the place depending on how much pipe has to be laid and what are the characteristics of the system, what's the characteristics of the source water, all sorts of things. But these numbers are quite a bit higher than the cost of imported water. So if we were going to do an actual side-by-side comparison of costs, this is part of the story. But there's more to it than that. I'm not going to get into questions of quality here or environmental benefits, and that's obviously a very important part. But I do want to talk about this notion of reliability, because what I see a lot from urban water managers in California is that they're focused on not being able to meet levels of demand in every year, and that's an important part of their planning. Well, I would lose my license to practice economics if I didn't show some kind of a graph like this that had some curves crossing. So bear with me for just 1 minute. What is the cost of unreliability? So what is the cost of, Peter showed the picture of the lawns going brown and taking a shower with a bucket, that kind of thing. What is the cost of that, of this mandatory short-term conservation? Well, there are two costs associated with it, really, when you break it down. The line that is sloping down at an angle, that's the demand curve for water, so that's the amount of money that people are willing to pay for different units of consumption. And the dashed line, the lower one, that's the beginning rate. Oh, here, I can actually do this. There. So this is the rate that's charged. This is the demand curve. So this is the amount of water that people would choose to consume. That's the target level of demand that the utility is trying to satisfy. Well, now suppose the utility says, uh-oh, we ran out of water from the delta. We don't have enough to sell you. We've only got this to sell. So what are the economic costs of that? Well, the first cost is that people have to cut back their consumption at the prevailing rate. And so they're willing to pay this amount of money. They actually have to pay this. They get this much less consumption. So if we add up this area under the demand curve above the rate, that's the first type of impact from not having enough water in the short term. So that's what we call in economics a loss in consumer surplus. But that's not the only cost. What usually happens in water utilities are very capital intensive. Most of the costs, say 90% of all the costs that water utilities bear, are fixed costs. And fixed costs don't change with the level of water that's going through their system by definition. So the rate that the utility charges is normally way above the actual marginal cost of putting one more unit of water through the system. So this line down here is marginal cost. And so what that means is that if the utility is selling less water, it's not covering its fixed costs. And if this were an investor-owned utility, the PUC would set up what's called a rate adjustment mechanism, and this amount of money that is no longer going to cover fixed costs, that would be used to raise rates in the future. So that's a second kind of a cost of this mandatory short-term conservation. So as an economist, this is the number, or this is the concept that we'd like to be able to put some numbers on. What is the value of reliability? How big is this shaded area? And what are the likely magnitudes of future disruptions? And what are the probabilities of them? Then, whether it's for Orange County or Ventura or San Diego or East Bay Mud, you can calculate what is the value of reliability. So you look at the reliability profiles of two alternative supplies, calculate a reliability premium, and then you can put these things on an equal basis. So we've actually been working a lot with water utilities throughout California for the last 4 or 5 years to implement this kind of a framework for reliability planning. And I should say, I mean, just to give full credit, this is normal in the electric industry. This kind of reliability planning is absolutely standard. It is not normal in water. At least it wasn't normal 5 years ago. It's becoming more normal. But so we're really extending something that is pretty common in other utility sectors. But to calculate this reliability premium, you need to know some information. You need to know something about that demand curve. How steeply does it slope for different sectors? You need to know the marginal cost of service. You need to know the magnitude and the probabilities of potential future outages. And so I'm not going to go through what else? Yeah, he's right. I would also lose my license if I didn't have something like that, because we're all about econometrics these days. But let me just show you some numbers that I think will indicate how important reliability is. So we look, just as a thought exercise, across all the water utilities in the Metropolitan Water District service area in Southern California. So this is, a lot of people in Southern California. I think, 17 or 18 million. And we looked at what would be the cost of a hypothetical mandatory 10% outage across that whole area, 20% and 30%. So this is just a 1-year outage of these percentages. And here are the numbers you get. Ratepayers would be willing to pay something like $235 million to avoid a 10% outage of 1 year in duration. If you increase that to 30%, which we've really never seen in California but might see in the future, that number grows to like $1.6 billion. That's for 1 year in just one part of California. So clearly this is consequential. And if you think about the implications of that change in state project deliveries that I showed you at the beginning, this could happen. Right? This is a logical consequence of that kind of a deterioration in a foundational water supply. Running that through a little bit more and getting to the probabilities, this is what might happen in Southern California if that state water project delivery curve shifts down the way I showed. And this shows you basically percent shortages and then the likelihood of them occurring in any given year. Traditionally, the line in Southern California has been the water supply is almost totally reliable. So this distribution would have been masked at 0. Not the case anymore. And you can see here, even for a shortage, something like 12.5%, which would be very, very large in historical terms. There have certainly been episodes of mandatory conservation where that was required, but they're uncommon, and this would be a big magnitude. That has something like a 15% chance of occurring in any given year. Right? So this is a very high, I would argue unacceptably high degree of unreliability unless something gets done. So if we calculate an implicit reliability premium for the year 2020, our thought exercise shows that coming out at between $200 and $400 per acre foot, down at the level of an individual utility. So we're looking at variations in demand. For the year 2035, that number goes to $500 to $1,000. Well, now these get to be really interesting magnitudes. Go back and compare, say, these numbers to these numbers. And if you add, you can do it one of two ways. You can subtract the reliability premium from the cost of the alternatives, or you can add it to the cost of the traditional supplies. If you add $500 to $1,000 to these numbers and compare to these numbers, now it's a much closer call. So if you put them on an equal footing in terms of relative degrees of reliability, if you're a water manager, these alternative investments make a lot more sense. So again, reliability is not the only answer, but it's something that I think is increasingly important and that water managers are conscious of. So to end with a comment that David made, here at a public university like Berkeley, we view this kind of outreach work as being fundamental to what we do. And certainly UC Berkeley researchers have made important contributions, not just in California, but beyond. But we view this as being sort of fundamental to our jobs. I work with a lot of the same agencies David does, probably a lot of the same agencies that Peter works with. But this way of thinking about the economics of adoption of different kinds of water supply alternatives, I think is getting traction. And we'll see where it all leads, but it is at a minimum very interesting. All right, thank you.